Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for Community Progress, I'd like to welcome you to today's Cornerstone webinar. My name is Justin Goddard, and I serve as the Program Officer for National Leadership and Education here at Community Progress. Cornerstone is our webinar series which equips participants with the building blocks to understand and solve tough challenges related to property vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration. This webinar in particular is part of our presentation series focused on COVID-19 related community response and recovery. For today's Cornerstone, we are joined by Kim Graziani, who serves as Vice President and Director of National Technical Assistance here at Community Progress. In her role, Kim oversees, coordinates, and helps deliver a diverse range of technical assistance to communities across the country that is focused on creating more equitable neighborhoods through preservation, acquisition, and equitable reuse of vacant and abandoned properties. Kim brings a unique perspective to this work given her background in local government, affordable housing, philanthropy, community organizing, and direct practice social work across the country. Before turning it over to Kim, I want to mention that we will allow time at the end of the presentation to answer questions. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your browser and send it to both the webinar host and all panelists. We will share both a video recording and the slide deck from today's presentation in the week following. Today's presentation is also our first with panelist video. We believe this feature will enhance the webinar experience. If you experience any technical difficulties, please use the chat box to message the Community Progress host or send an email to Justin Goddard at jgoddard@communityprogress.net. Finally, Community Progress has created a COVID-19 resource center, which can be accessed on our website and provides resources and weekly updates for neighborhoods looking to prevent vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration related to current economic and health challenges. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kim.
Great, thank you, Justin. Okay, so a big thank you to everyone who has joined us for today's webinar. To say that there is a lot going in the world right now is the understatement of the century, and we do appreciate your choice to be with us today. I'd also be remiss if I didn't start off by saying that all of us here at Community Progress share a commitment to continue addressing systemic racism in this country. As the COVID-19 public health crisis evolved into a housing and economic crisis that could unfold for many years, there's a renewed focus on a growing interest around land banks and land banking programs. And despite these heavy times, we thought this was an important opportunity to recognize land banking as a critical tool for equitable recovery. So here's a quick overview of today's webinar. First, a quick introduction of who we are and our focus on racial equity. Then a discussion on the opportunity and challenges that lie in front of us given the COVID crisis. Next, we'll provide a quick overview of land banking to ensure everyone's on the same foundational page. Then we'll discuss the important role that land banks can play in the long-term equitable recovery from COVID-19, and then we'll look ahead at what is needed moving forward. Last but not least, and most important, time will be allocated for your questions. As Justin mentioned, please submit your questions in the bottom right-hand side of the screen. So let's get started. So we at the Center for Community Progress, and hopefully most of you on the webinar are familiar with us, but we're a national nonprofit organization that has been around for about 10 years and decided to focus all of our efforts on vacant and abandoned properties. So why the heck did we decide to do that? So here at the Center for Community Progress, we recognize that vacant and abandoned properties create significant barriers to racially equitable communities. Barriers that I'm sure many of you know, but just to name a few, the loss of equity in a family's home that happens to be on a block that has a lot of vacant and abandoned properties, which equates to a loss of generational wealth. Or the public safety, public health, psychological impacts of going to school or work each day and being bombarded by signs of disinvestment and a sense that nobody cares for your community. Through our various program areas and broad reach to numerous communities, we remain focused on systems level change by constantly asking and doing our best to address the following questions. How do we change the systems that contribute to so many of our neighborhoods across the country that are disparately impacted by vacancy and abandonment? And how do we change the systems that keep these properties and communities in a state of decline? As many of you know, preaching to the choir, that systems level change is not easy, and it makes this work unique and quite challenging, particularly given the recognition that the problems associated with vacancy and abandonment are deeply entrenched and require a willingness from policymakers, funders, residents, all sorts of people to change the status quo, which is not always that easy. So we also recognize that vacancy and abandonment was not created overnight, nor was it unintentional. And there's a long history of systems that have been created that are based on racist policies and practices and continue to contribute to the injustices we see today. Many times, it's those neighborhoods that are most concentrated in vacancy and abandonment that are also where Black, Indigenous, people of color call home. Unless we call this history out, it's going to be really difficult to move forward. So what you see here is just a few examples. The map that you see is a map that was created by the federal government's Homeowners Loan Corporation in the late 1930s to designate which communities, in this case in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, were too risky or labeled too dangerous to lend to. And were colored red on this map, or what we call redlining. Those that were determined to be too risky or hazardous were denied mortgages. And one of the key factors in making this decision was based on the percentage of people of color who lived in that neighborhood. And to this day, those neighborhoods considered hazardous or too risky are still the same neighborhoods that we work in to a great extent and have the greatest vacancy and abandonment. Urban renewal, which gained momentum through various pieces of federal housing and highway legislation after World War II, which designated certain areas as blighted or slum areas to justify the removal of many stable Black households and businesses for the sake of redevelopment. This is one of the reasons why I personally don't use the term blight or blighted because of these negative implications of how the word has been used. So can we as a society and as a field of community development practitioners, as people who care about our neighbors, can we see any opportunity in the midst of all of these challenges that are presented by the COVID-19 crisis? So this is an excerpt from an address made by the UN Secretary General that implores leaders from across the world that recovery from the coronavirus must lead to a better world. And not only is there an opportunity, in my humble opinion, it's more than an opportunity. It's an obligation to not return to normal. Let's not even accept the new normal. Let's do everything we can, use our privilege, challenge our biases, and really put our expertise and passions into practice to create a better and more just world. So yes, there are many challenges that are presented by COVID-19, and many of which we do not know, which is very important to preface all of this with. What we do know is we're seeing record high unemployment rates. moratoria on evictions and mortgage foreclosures that are soon to expire. Many of our local government partners are not only predicting massive budget shortfalls, but are already feeling the effects from less taxes from wages, sales, hotels, casinos, you name it. And what might this lead to? Homeowners choosing to put food on the table instead of fixing the leaky roof, more properties becoming deteriorated. Tenants and property owners not being able to pay back rent or their mortgage after the moratoria expires, more properties becoming vacant and abandoned. And what we do know is that, unfortunately, this crisis, as with other crises, all have a disparate impact on our Black and Brown communities. So next, I'm going to talk a little bit about land banks and land banking, and to really kind of tell you why all of this does have to do with land banks and land banking. But I do want to preface that this is a very brief overview, noting that for those of you who want or need more information on the basics of land banking, I encourage you to go to our website. We have so many incredible resources, including a webinar we did just a few months ago that provides more of a basic Land Bank 101 guidance. So what is a land bank and what is a land banking program? So a land bank is a governmental entity, or land banking is a program that is created by a local government that acquires, holds, and stewards vacant, abandoned, deteriorated, or tax delinquent properties to support equitable community development outcomes. Yes, that is a very large mouthful. But what I'd like to point you to is some important terms, which is a governmental entity or program that is created or designated by a local government, an entity that has a focus on a specific subset of properties that are causing the most harm to a community, vacant, abandoned, deteriorated, or tax delinquent, and to equitably support a local community's goals. The neighborhoods we just discussed that bear the brunt of vacancy and abandonment are the exact focus of land banks and land banking programs across the country. The properties that are underwater in value, stuck in some type of legal limbo, inaccessible to the private market and to neighbors alike, are the focus of land banks and land banking programs. The people who are most impacted by this disinvestment are the priority of land banks and land banking programs. There are approximately 200 land banks across the country, and most of these land banks have been formed based on some type of state enabling legislation. And the 5 states you see on the screen here, Michigan, Ohio, New York, Pennsylvania, and Georgia, are the 5 states that have the most land banks, and in many ways are leading the land bank movement. So what are the key powers of land banks? Given the vast majority of vacant and abandoned properties are also tax delinquent and serve as, well, they are. I mean, the bottom line is the majority of the inventory is tax delinquent. The most effective land banks are those directly linked to the local property tax enforcement process or system, and are granted special powers, governmental powers, through legislation to do the following. So one is to intervene in the tax foreclosure process ahead of speculators and investors. Why is this so important? We have seen too many times communities, especially facing financial difficulties, make the poor decision to do such things as sell the delinquent taxes to private investors, losing all control of the future of that property. Some communities have decided to have public auctions and sell these properties to the highest bidder and to unknown entities. And some of the worst problem properties we've seen time and time again often go with whoever has the highest bid. They're sold for pennies on the dollar. The bidders who milk the profit from these properties by rarely making improvements or paying property taxes and still renting the property without regard to the tenant's safety or their health. Land banks are able to cost effectively acquire properties from this foreclosure pipeline, clear title, which is incredibly important, and flexibly sell properties to responsible owners that promise to meet community needs and be responsible. So given the majority of land banks are governmental entities created by state and local governments pursuant to state statutes and local ordinances, and yes, some are also 501c3 designated as nonprofit entities. It's important to recognize that because of this, they are also publicly accountable. So how can land banks be most effective? Land banks need more than optimal state legislation to function equitably, efficiently, and effectively. The most successful land banks are also backed by strong leadership, local financial support, collaborative multi-sector partnerships, and are committed to transparency, accountability, equity, and inclusion. There must be alignment with other strategies to ensure a land bank is used as a last resort. The last thing that anyone wants is a land bank basically getting overwhelmed with the unsustainable pipeline of properties going into their inventory. Land banks serve as critical intermediary and property pipeline to support a local community's goals, therefore must develop priorities based on their own community, and particularly those that are most impacted by vacancy and abandonment, given the majority of a land bank's inventory will be from those communities. And given the history of land use policy and the justifiable mistrust of any public entity acquiring properties in these communities, land banks must be transparent and accountable. There are a variety of ways that land banks do this, from land banks board of directors, which is the usual governance structure, making sure that there are residents that are part of the board of directors to ensure inclusive governance and decision making. Some land banks create community advisory committees that are made up of residents to help create policies and priorities for how land banks acquire and sell properties that support rather than displace a community. And other land banks have full-time staff that are solely focused on engaging the community where they work. There are many reasons why land banks are critical to the long-term equitable recovery from the COVID-19 crisis. But one in particular I want to spend a little bit of time on is the fact that land banks have continued evolving over several decades. These entities have become flexible community development tools that have been adapted to address historic racist land use and housing policies, the inequitable impacts of decline, more current climate change crises, financial crises, and all to catalyze community transformation. On your screen, you'll see an example of a land bank in Albany, New York, whereby you can see that the current inventory of this land bank is almost a direct overlay of the redlining maps that we just discussed a moment ago. So some of the earlier land banks were more associated with what we call legacy cities, or former hubs of industry and manufacturing that experienced severe population loss. We all know these. I worked in the city of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for several years. Many believed for a long time that vacancy and abandonment were just associated with the Rust Belt or the typical weak market cities, such as those on the screen. But what we saw is that following the Great Recession, which obviously destabilized so many neighborhoods and so many places that weren't quite ever associated with vacancy and abandonment before, and the National Land Bank movement surged. Approximately 15 states between 2009 and 2019 have passed some form of state land bank legislation. And we're really proud that many of them have been created with the support of community progress. So the Great Recession was not the only trigger for land banks, and more recently, the effects of climate change have continued to disrupt communities, as we all know. And climate change obviously leaves behind its own disruptions. Trauma, fractured neighborhoods, a sudden new inventory of damaged abandoned properties. And because of this, land banks are again emerging as possible solutions for long-term recovery efforts. Land banks are being championed to help triage the wreckage of hurricanes and floods, and thankfully with a much stronger emphasis on equity, which in my opinion is a principle that too many disaster recovery efforts have lost in the mix. So whether the Rust Belt or the Sun Belt or anywhere else for that matter, urban, suburban, rural communities, red or blue political enclaves, land banks have traversed the seemingly intractable divisions that currently define our country to achieve many positive impacts and outcomes. These are just simply a sampling for today's conversation. In New York, thanks to the infusion of funding and support from the New York Attorney General's office as part of the National Mortgage Settlement Funds, more than $120 million in grants and private investment have been leveraged to address thousands of very harmful properties across the state. In West Virginia, specifically Huntington, West Virginia, a community that's been hit hard by the decline of the coal industry. A small municipal land bank, in addition to other strategies, demolition is not the only strategy, but they have demolished over 100 properties last year alone as part of a public safety campaign to combat the local opioid crisis. Several land banks across Michigan have mobilized and have employed teams of passionate residents to clean and green large inventories of vacant lands and have channeled millions of dollars, federal dollars, to support neighborhood stabilization efforts. In Atlanta, Georgia, there's the local land bank and community land trust have forged a partnership to direct land bank properties to support permanent affordable housing. And last but not least, land banks in Ohio, which currently benefit from a very unique funding structure and mechanism that was established as part of their 2009 land bank legislation. They've innovated some of the most creative housing partnerships in the country, from turning tax foreclosed properties into housing choices for domestic violence survivors, refugees, college graduates, low-income families, and individuals, you name it. So, as you can hopefully see, land banks have successfully stabilized and revitalized neighborhoods impacted by a long history of inequitable policies and practices and disrupted by any number of shocks, the housing crisis, climate change, you name it. Now we're on the verge of another unprecedented crisis that is certain to disrupt the places we call home. And so now is the time to invest in land banks to successfully navigate this public health crisis and its implications on neighborhoods across the country. These words on the screen are just a few key reminders of what makes land banks one of the most critical tools to support the long-term equitable recovery from COVID-19. We need entities with flexibility and nimbleness to address the myriad of emerging challenges. We need entities that are publicly accountable and responsible stewards to our communities. We need entities that will remain steadfast on the growing inventory of properties that are inaccessible and problematic to our communities, and particularly to those communities that are home to Black, Indigenous, and people of color. We need entities that do not define what a community needs, but rather serves as an intermediary or vehicle to support a local community's goals. So this is the role of land banks in the COVID-19 recovery. Land banks need to double down on their part of the ecosystem of community development, do what they do well, and recognize that they are part of an integral system that acquires, holds, flexibly sells, disposes problem properties. They're very good at that. And if there's a piece of that sort of larger ecosystem that's missing in your community or in your community development circle, land banks with appropriate staff and funding and leadership are really going to be able to take some more risks and try to fill the gap that is probably going to be ever more present as a result of COVID. Possibly focusing on supporting more quality, affordable rental housing, possibly lending more support to local small businesses. And if indeed land banks are able to get the level of funding they need, there's also going to be a huge responsible for them to do more, right? And to hold themselves publicly accountable. So what's next and what's needed? So for those of you on the webinar who are considering land banking, I encourage you to just take a few minutes or days or weeks to really have some discussions with your partners and to really think through the problem you are trying to solve. What will be your initial target inventory, both current inventory of the properties that seem insolvable, and also anticipating the inventory that may come down the pike because of the COVID-19 crisis. Are there other entities, programs, policies that can already address this problem? The last thing we want to do in a time of very limited resources is to create a whole nother entity that's going to take more pieces of the pie. Who are your partners? Remember that a land bank is not the panacea of every single problem in your community. And land banks must work with other partners to address the systemic changes that are needed. And particularly in the beginning of any discussion about creating a land bank, please make sure to manage expectations. Again, land banks can't solve it all, but they can be really good partners, and they also have a very specific set of expertise for a specific subset of properties that may be very helpful in your community. I guess one of the last questions I urge all of you who are thinking about land banking, and even those who we would consider the sort of land banking heroes or legacy leaders across the country, which is, what will success look like and who will benefit from it? Even the most well-intentioned actions have unintended consequences. Don't let this be an afterthought. Even for those land bank leaders, again, on today's webinar, when is the last time that you have held up a mirror to yourself and continued to ask these very important questions? And at the end of the day, all of us have to not only ask ourselves that question, but be able to respond accordingly based on the answer. And it may be an answer that maybe some of us are not all that thrilled with. So what's needed? So for communities that have land banks and at the inevitable risk of preaching to the choir, more funding and resources are desperately needed for land banks to successfully navigate their part of this public health crisis and its implications for neighborhoods across the country. We need to bring more real estate under community control and help build local wealth. We need to ratchet up the production of quality, affordable housing to unprecedented levels in every community, whether it's a city, whether it's a suburb, whether it's the rural areas. We need to accelerate our commitment to inclusion and rebuild for resiliency. This recovery work must, in large part, be funded by the federal government. As we've talked about, local and state governments are already facing staggering budget shortfalls, and unfortunately, that situation could continue for years to come. So, for policymakers, philanthropy, others who hold positions of power, the past is prologue. If we do not address the levels of funding that are needed at very high levels, history will repeat itself. We don't want to go down that road of selling tax lien, losing control of the fate of properties. And here, as you can see on the slide, are a few of the more common funding sources for land banks. So the most effective land banks have strong local support, and including financial support from obviously their local governments. As we've talked about, this is and will continue to be a huge, huge challenge. And likely land banks that are dependent on that local contribution will be impacted. The most effective land banks have dedicated source of revenue. Granted, there are very few places and land banks that have that. But for those land banks in Ohio who benefit from the delinquent tax assessment collection, or what we call DTAC, whereby a portion of the delinquent tax revenue is allocated to the county treasurer, which then can be allocated to the county land bank, that revenue source could see either a huge decline in the amount or a huge increase, depending on some critical decisions that need to be made statewide and locally regarding property tax relief. Even those land banks, and there's a few of you out there that are able to very brilliantly get some of your local taxing jurisdictions to voluntarily submit a portion of their delinquent tax revenue, these decisions are going to become a heck of a lot harder if the total revenue that they receive is down. Without this federal infusion, we are prone, again, to repeat the mistakes of the past, and we just can't do that. This time is way, way, way too important. So, rightfully so, to this day, federal funding has been very much focused on the immediate crisis itself. Now is also the time to discuss and to really think through and start funding the recovery from this crisis. And not just a plain old recovery, an equitable recovery for the long term. In our discussions with many of the land banks across the country, they're ready and willing for this. They're ready, able, and willing, I would say, for this challenge. And of course, just as they are just one of the many partners in any given community that needs to be deployed, particularly for systemic change to happen, they, at the same time, also must be held accountable by their local community. So before we go to question and answer period, I really want to sort of just emphasize the challenge to our field and to our community, which is, one, we have a history, a very bad history of racist land use and housing policy that has left, to this day, many communities segregated and have concentrated poverty. Two, because of this poverty and this concentrated poverty, we have a huge racialized wealth gap in this country. At the same time, housing justice and thinking of housing as a human right, as a universal demand, is coming from all aspects of our society right now, which is incredible to see. And then we also have climate change that is obviously not going away anytime soon. And then to make things maybe even worse, we have this thing called COVID-19. So while there are so many connections to all of these challenges that I've just stated, one thing that connects all of these is land. Land is wealth, land is power, land is liberation. And who has access to it? Who owns it? Who decides how it's used? Land banks probably never assumed that they would play such a pivotal role in advancing racial equity, but they do. And it's a challenge, it is a responsibility, and quite frankly, it's an awesome privilege to embrace. So I am going to pause there. I am actually going to stop my video for 1 second so I can attempt to clarify and compile all of the questions that you all have been actively submitting. And while I press this pause button, I also encourage all of you who haven't submitted questions to, again, click on the lower right-hand side chat box and please submit your questions. It looks like, given the number of questions and emails we're getting, we may not get to all of them, but I will definitely try my darndest. So just pause for 1 second. Okay, boy, you guys have submitted some fantastic questions. So I am going to jump in, and again, bear with me as I continue scrolling down and trying to answer all these great questions. So let me start with the easiest one, which is basically, is this webinar being recorded and will it be available? Yes, it is being recorded. And as Justin mentioned in the beginning, it will be available on our website. If you actually go, I think it's to resources, there's actually a Cornerstone webinar link that you can click, and it actually gives you a link to our recording on YouTube and otherwise of our previous webinars. So there were several questions about the clarification between whether a land bank can be a private nonprofit versus a government entity. So the answer is yes. However, as an organization, we feel very strongly that an entity that has governmental powers to intervene in a tax foreclosure process, that uses those powers to acquire properties, it absolutely has to be considered a public or governmental entity because there has to be a serious level of accountability. While there may be many nonprofits, private nonprofits out there that are incredibly transparent, and absolutely those nonprofits and other private entities are needed, right? It can't just be a land bank. However, the way we define land banks and land banking programs is very much focused on being a governmental entity first. As I mentioned, some land banks also receive their 501c3 designation, so are also considered nonprofit entities. But again, because many state statutes give land banks special powers, again, to intervene in the tax foreclosure process to be able to clear and extinguish past debts or liens on the property, to get clear title, to hold properties tax exempt, to be able to have that level of flexibility in terms of governance structure and supporting local community goals. For all of those reasons, we absolutely do talk about land banking and the importance of land banking in that governmental context. Second question was, really good question. I hope I can give this question justice, which is, are there lessons learned from previous federal funding programs such as NSP and hardest hit funds and all of that? And that's a very loaded question. And I guess what I can say is, in our discussions with many land banks across the country, we've asked that question, which is, what are the lessons learned from some of the larger infusions of funding that land banks have received as part of 10 years ago with the foreclosure crisis? And at least we've heard loud and clear thus far is there's such a need for flexibility of funds in terms of what it can be used for, but yet also holding land banks accountable, and that you could have both a flexible source of funding, but also make sure that that funding is accountable. Many land banks brought up the fact that while there was a lot of funding that was used to acquire or demolish properties, particularly after the foreclosure crisis, that a lot of land banks were held with a lot of inventory and no money to maintain the property. So again, the lesson learned is thinking about not just flexible, accountable funding, but how can that funding be used for a longer term? It's very difficult in this society right now to, and in government in general, to think past the next election, right? But the land that is acquired by land banks doesn't necessarily have an immediate end user, right? And some can say, then why the heck are land banks acquiring it? The reason why land banks are acquired is because nobody else will. And unless we get that under some type of responsible ownership control and clear that title, it is going to continue posing severe costs to the neighbors who live on the street, to the neighborhood where that property is located, and to local government. By not doing anything at all, actually costs local government and the residents that live in that community a whole heck of a lot. The other last thing I'll point out to you in terms of the lessons learned from federal funding is also, you know, a lot of land banks we're talking to are very, very committed to becoming more active in addressing the need for quality, affordable housing in their community. And because of that, we can give land banks a whole heck of a lot of money to acquire, to maintain the properties. But if we are also not providing significant subsidy on the back end to actually support these affordable housing deals outside of LIHTC and some of the other tax credit deals that we know of, which are good, but more needs to happen. So again, really looking at funding from sort of the entire pipeline of community development and of affordable housing. Another question that actually just came up again is how to make the case for creating a land bank in your own community. And it's a great question, and it's probably a challenge that we deal with all the time in our work at Community Progress. And I would say that probably the #1 pitch to your local government is what I just mentioned, which is what is doing nothing costing your community? Can you take 5 to 10 symbolic problem properties that most people would know the address of off the top of their head, that keeps neighbors up at night, that keeps the code enforcement officials in your local government up at night? Can you just take 5 to 10 of those properties and simply calculate the cost of how much money has been spent on those properties from your local government? How many property taxes have been lost, right? Again, there's a huge association with vacant and abandoned properties and tax delinquency. So what's the lost property tax revenue? What is the loss of value in properties that are adjacent to that vacant and abandoned property? That's sometimes a little bit harder to calculate. But what are the police, fire, and public safety responses? Think about it. Every time you send a fire truck, a squad car, that costs the local jurisdiction money. Every time a housing and building code inspector gets sent to board up the window or maybe even do an emergency demolition, that costs that local government a lot of money. And then I would just finally say that, you know, after you calculate those costs, yes, it does usually make a pretty compelling case, but I would also really encourage you, and we have to remind ourselves of this as well at Community Progress, which is, yes, there is a quantifiable and negative impact, right, to make about the need to focus on vacancy and abandonment. But there is a human qualitative element of this. And again, I think most of the people on this webinar know this, but please don't underestimate the importance of having people talk about the impacts of these negative property, or these vacant and abandoned properties that continue to decline in their neighborhood. What does that mean for them? What does that mean for their child? What does that mean for the local school district? So again, I think that there's several ways of making the case. And if anyone wants to brainstorm that a little bit more, we'd be more than happy to do that. Let's see here. Okay, so there's a few questions that are asking about strategies for land banks partnering with locally based community land trusts. So great question. We have been really proud and honored to work with our national partner, the Grounded Solutions Network, who has a membership of community land trusts across the country. And we have, you know, kind of researched all of the various jurisdictions across the country where both a land bank and a CLT are located. We've asked the question to many land bank leaders and CLT leaders saying, why aren't there more examples of land bank and CLT partnerships? And the bottom line is, one, there are not as many examples of land bank CLT partnerships as I think we would like to see. Two, I think one of the reasons for that is basically a miscommunication from the land bank of what a CLT is, and a miscommunication or misunderstanding from a CLT of what a land bank is. And both a land bank and a CLT are different, but they are very, very complementary. And the ability of a land bank to acquire properties that are stuck, right, are underwater in value, using the special powers they have, the governmental powers, and to be able to create a pipeline that is quick and efficient to give to a community land trust for permanent affordable housing it kind of seems like a no-brainer. And we are seeing examples of more and more partnerships across the country. And I think as a few examples, if you may want to take a look at Albany, New York. I think there are some of our friends from Albany that are on the call. Atlanta, Georgia, which I mentioned. We're working with some of the folks in Houston, Texas, having some really interesting conversations in other places like Portland, Oregon, Miami, Florida. And there are various ways that we could talk about land banks and land banking as creating that pipeline. So we do have some additional resources on our website. Okay, let me see here. It looks like we have time for maybe one more question. Oh my gosh, there's so many here. Okay, so one question that came in, which again, I talked about briefly, is can you speak more about vacancy in relation to commercial properties and how land banks can support local small businesses, which is a great question. And again, I think we really need to focus on what land banks do well and what are they created to do, right? particularly given this COVID-19 crisis. We've heard it on the news, we've probably seen it in our local communities, depending on where we live, that there are a significant number of smaller businesses, and particularly MWB businesses and businesses that are owned by entrepreneurs of color that were already on that margin line, right, of whether they were going to succeed or not. Now, what we don't want is for those storefronts to become vacant and empty and then just kind of go by the wayside. So if there are situations where people have vacated those commercial spaces, and if they're tax delinquent, maybe if they're not even tax delinquent, then obviously a land bank can play a larger role in acquiring that property, right? And making sure that there is mechanisms in place to get another local business into that structure. But I think more importantly, again, land banks are one piece of the puzzle. What we have been seeing across the country is land banks partnering with local government, with philanthropy, with a whole host of different partners to figure out how to provide immediate financial support for businesses that are on that breaking point line. Again, do land banks have the funding to provide sort of emergency loans? Probably not. However, there are people that are creating some very quick emergency recoverable grants and loans to a lot of the smaller businesses in our communities to give them at least an extra few months, right, to kind of really figure out how they can move forward to serve their community and to support their family. I also think for those businesses that really realize they just can't afford that space or the space just doesn't fit them, that is exactly where a land bank can come into play. Again, to work with local businesses, to work with families, to work with everyone in between to figure out, is there another property in that inventory that can be used to support that business, that family? So I'm getting a few flags from my colleague to start wrapping up. So I do just want to say that there are several questions that are asking really good questions about the very basics of land banking. Tell me more about the funding sources. Tell me more about, the state statutes. And again, I used terms that probably 10 or 15 years ago, I had no idea what they meant. And again, for the purpose of this presentation, I really did have to go past the basics of land banking a little bit quicker than in others. But you'll see additional resources that are on the screen. The seminal publication by my colleague, Frank Alexander, and co-founder of Community Progress, that really does a great job of giving the 101 of land banks and land banking, gives actual copies of state statutes from other jurisdictions, gives you sample policies and procedures, you name it. We also have the Take It to the Bank publication that my team, the National Technical Assistance Team, and as well with Peyton Hines, who's from our Michigan team, put together, that kind of summarizes the sort of best practices of land banks, for lack of a better term. And then the final two resources that we have listed here, again, there's many more on our website, are some reports we did for state land bank in partnership with state land bank associations in Georgia and New York. And again, I thank you all. And if you, again, are in a state that has land banks, I also really encourage you to contact your state land banking association, which there are a few in the states that have the most land banks, who are incredibly adept at answering your questions and can really put you in a larger community with other land banks in your state. There's my contact information, and Justin, I see you staring at me, so I will wrap it up. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate your time, and are definitely going to be available for more questions as they come in. And again, please look at our website for more resources.
All right. I first want to say big thank you to Kim for a really, really great presentation, and also being the first of our staff to use video on a webinar, which is an accomplishment. So I want to say, shout out to her. I also want to thank all of you for participating in today's webinar. Our next webinar will be on June 25th, and we'll focus on community leadership and community residents addressing vacancy and abandonment in their communities. Please visit our website for both more information on this and other webinars, as well as the other resources which Kim has talked about. And hope you will have a great afternoon.